Hi everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.2 demo for the piece I call Drop Dead and Gorgeous. So I recently reposted this and people have been interested in seeing the behind the scenes on it because I went with a way more painterly look and feel than I normally do. But before we actually get into how I did that or why I did that, we have to cover this first. This was my first attempt at coloring this piece, and I abandoned it a long time ago. So this sketch that you see appear right there and quickly go to a lower opacity, I did that in a sketchbook a number of years ago when I was working at a previous company. I was in some meeting or something and I just doodled it, and I always really liked it and wanted to bring it to color but just never got around to it. And a couple years ago on Procreate, I thought it'd be a great opportunity to bring it in and try some things. Honestly though, it went terribly. You'll see that the color scheme is similar to the final piece, but I wouldn't say that I was unsure about how I was going to do it, but I was unsure about what I wanted to do that might be special with it. So you see me doing my flats here, and the flattening process is fine. It's sort of the usual way that I go about things. The flats are somewhat clean, but I anticipated trying to bring some sort of, energy to it later so that it didn't remain too stiff. But I was just a big fan of the sketch. I was very happy with the way that came out, and I think maybe there was a little bit too much pressure I was putting on myself to make sure I was getting it right, because when that happens, I find I do my worst work usually. So before this video runs out, I just want to talk about the things that I think went wrong. So I think, again, the color scheme is fine, but you can see here when I start the painting process, it's very soft. Now I use that soft brush from time to time, and it works out fine. However, in this case, it did not work out fine. And I think what it was there's a problem with using that type of a brush sometimes. If let's just say the brush can make things look really slick and really smooth. I don't mean slick like the surface is slick. I mean like the piece is like almost too engineered and too mechanical. And I think that's what was happening here. We've got this contrast problem where the highs are a little too high, and it's making her look a little plasticky and a little shiny, and that just isn't really working for it. I'm already sensing that, and at this point, instead of sensing that I'm doing this badly and I can save it, I felt like I was doing this badly and I wasn't going to be able to save it. This was a piece that I really wanted it to look really nice, and it just wasn't looking nice. So I wanted to make sure that I showed this part to you guys, because I think it's really valuable to see sort of when to call it and say that it's just not working out. I also set this gray background. I honestly don't know what was going through my head. I don't know why I thought that the gray background was going to be it, but this is where I abandoned it. What you're seeing on screen right now is where I decided that there was no hope for this and I needed to move on to something else. So I put it away. I put it in my on hold folder, which is filled with things that I haven't finished but I hope to someday, and I plan on eventually bringing it out again and giving it another shot. If you've been looking at some of my recent videos, you've been seeing me mess around with the Turpentine brush, and I've been using it in that technique where I have a blurred duplicate and then I use a mask in order to sort of bring that blur out and make it look a little bit messier and painterly. Well, here's that Turpentine brush just as it is when you use color. And I hadn't really considered painting something with just like this. I mean, not that I didn't think it was possible or something, I just hadn't considered doing it. So here's me doing a bunch of different strokes so you can see sort of how this Turpentine brush reacts. It has a tremendous amount of paint laid down in the beginning, falls off really quickly, but then stays steady. You can see that in those strokes there. In order for it to be solid, you have to do what I'm doing here, where I'm doing a different application. I'm just tap, 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 and building up those strokes. I then stroke right through it so that you can see what it does when it streaks through the paint before. Here's now some blue on a new layer. You can see that it streaks within itself, but it doesn't actually affect the orange underneath, and it doesn't pick up the orange underneath. Its transparency is the only thing that's giving the illusion that it is doing so. So now if we merge those two layers together and grab the purple brush and we start going through it, you can see what that blending looks like. And if you hold down the brush, you don't lift up, you can start swirling it around and mixing that together a little bit. But it will always try to sort of favor the color that you have. It'll always continue to add some of that color that you already have. Here I'm using the smudge with the turpentine brush, and you can see you can get a much better blend that way. It's softer, it's a little bit blurrier, and that's like a good way to bring two colors together. And at that point it's similar, not the same, but it's similar to actually using paint. So here we'll take some purple, we'll switch over to some green, and then we'll put those on the same layer next to each other, and then we'll use that smudge to try and bring those together. So you can just sort of see what that looks like when you're kind of mixing those two colors together. Now we'll sample that so you can see what that new color was. Obviously these two colors make sort of a gray. It's not like I'm creating a brand new rich color, but you can at least see how that color play works together. What you're gonna see on the piece is this type of a thing. It's all the same stuff that I've shown you in past videos. We're just building on it, and we're using a different brush this time. So we use the turpentine brush to lay down our flat, except in this case our flat is a little bit messier. And then we're going to use a light orange, a brownish orangish tan, and we're setting that layer to multiply and then painting on top of it. This is exactly what I've shown you guys in previous videos, except now we're using a messier, more stylized and natural looking brush. So here we are a couple of years after my failed color pass on this sketch. I've now used the new canvas ratios that I use most of the time when you see me on this channel, which is 9 inches by 12 inches, or 12 inches by 9 inches, in this case 12 inches by 9 inches, and I'm using the turpentine brush to do the flats. Well, I mean, I'm going to be using it to paint the entire thing, but that's what you're seeing here is the flat process. I will say that going into this, I had very little expectation about what I was going to be able to achieve. I sort of dragged this piece out thinking to myself, oh, this is the piece that I could never figure out how to color. Let's see if by combining the fear of getting it wrong with a brand new brush, if I'll be able to do it, which is actually a recipe for disaster if you know sort of the psychology of trying new things. I'm sort of layering on past failure plus trying something new, which is kind of a mistake. However, in this case, I sort of said to myself, I took those two things, but then I mixed it with, it doesn't have to succeed. Let's actually just go in and have some fun and see what happens. Let's borrow some of the palette that we had from before, maybe change some ideas here or there and just sort of see how this whole thing goes. And let's try to just broaden a skill set a little bit. Expectations, let's try to keep them as low as possible. Have you ever gone into a movie expecting it to be bad and then it was actually really good? That's kind of what happened here. I had very low expectations of what I'd be able to achieve here, and then as the process went on and I found myself being able to do things that I was worried I wasn't going to be able to do, it sort of increased the reward that I felt by getting it right. And that to me is actually something that is amazing, but you can't engineer that. It's completely accidental most of the time. I don't know anybody who's been able to consistently get that going, but that's what happened here, and that's why I'm just really happy with the way this ultimately came out. So we're talking about Procreate here, right? So layer limits are always a problem, and I know that if I'm going more painterly, layer limit is always a concern. I'm gonna have to merge things. So the reason why I went with the idea of a shadow layer set to multiply was explicitly because I wanted to keep my layer limits down, or my layer count down, because of the layer limit. And that was going to, I knew when I was doing it, that was going to alleviate some of the pressure of trying to get the image right, because I could take file management sort of out of my mind. So at this point I've decided I'm going to do the select paint, select clear method, which I've talked about a lot in the past, which is also down below in the description. And that was going to be the way that I would try to combat some of the complexity of doing new brush, new techniques, and a piece that I had failed on before. This was the way that I was going to try and get over that, by limiting that complexity. So at this point now, I'm doing the flats. You can see I'm doing the distant eyelash, the eyelashes on the distant eye. And I'm essentially thinking just in flats. I'm thinking in like a very rudimentary way. It's similar to when you see me do my more simplistic pieces, simplistic from a sort of file complexity point of view. I'm treating everything like I would in those scenarios. So it's flat for the neck and body, flat for the wounds on the neck, flat for the bone, another flat for the head, the face and ear, another flat for the eye, another flat for the meat in the eye, that little pink part in corner of everybody's eye, flat for the eyelash, and then going back in and adding in some extra depth by having like the color of the lips for the lipstick, the color around the eye for like the eyeshadow and the socket of the eye. These are all the techniques that I use when I'm doing sort of a flatter, more cartoonish look. And I'm just doing it here. This is really like through and through all past techniques, except now I'm trying to do it with a more complex, harder to manage brush that I'm not used to. And now you see we're going in with a red, like a reddish brown for the shadow, because what I'm going to go for is a warm, let's just keep it simple, let's say a warm shadow and a cool light, which that's also what sort of gives this piece a little bit of the flavor that it has. And you can see I'm doing select paint, select clear. So I'm starting by selecting my lowest layer in my stack and then going onto this layer that's all the way at the top that's set to multiply. And then I paint that section and then I select the next, and when I say select, I mean making a selection. You tap on the layer and then you tap on select layer and then select the contents of that layer, and then I'm clearing it and then I'm moving up. You know, I get a lot of questions on why this is a good method and why I don't do like layer masks or something like that. Let's quickly run through select paint, select clear again, and let's talk about why I may or may not use certain techniques. So I think the three main ones that people ask about when they ask why I use this technique are masks, alpha lock, and clipping masks. So let's start with regular masks first. So here, let's just create 3 shapes. Now I want to be clear here, I almost never use clipping masks, but I do use regular masks from time to time. There's certainly uses for them. However, in Procreate specifically, as part of your main flow, it's actually pretty inefficient, and we'll get into that. So here we have 3 colors. We're going to start by setting up here's our color that we'll use for our shadow. We'll just use it as a multiply, just like I'm using in the piece. Let's create these layers right here. So we will select the shape, and then we will create a mask on that layer that we're going to use for our shadow. So you can see here we have to set up 3 separate layers that are each going to be the shadow for each one of these color shapes, because they're really nothing else more specific, so I'm going to call them color shapes, I suppose. So now on this layer we set it to multiply. We'll just take this simple one. I did forget to set it to multiply, so let's just go ahead and paint it. And now let's set it to multiply. You'll see the shadow will kick in. So there we go. Now we have a shadow set up, and we're going to do the same thing on this one. And I forgot to set it again, so let's set it to multiply now. Okay, and then we're going to do it on this one. And you can see that the shadow color is being kept within the shape because the layer that it's on has been masked as the same shape as the color shapes that we're working with. You can see them right there on each one of those. So now, just to keep things simple, but to start illustrating the complexity of this, we're going to create a highlight layer on each one of these shapes. So we're going to set each one of those to overlay with a blue for overlay, because that's what we did in the piece that you see in this video. And each one of these now is also going to get a mask. So we're going to go ahead and do that right there, and then add some on the blue. Set that to overlay again, and then we'll do some on the green as well. Now you can start seeing on the right how kind of berserk this layer stack is already starting to get. One other thing that has to be done here, at least in the case of the techniques that I'm using, is that we have to select the shadow layer and delete away from the highlight layer. Now you could also add the shadow layer to your mask, but I mean 6 to 1, half dozen to the other on this. You could go either way. Now, are we getting the desired look? Absolutely. I mean, this is really rough, but we're getting what we've set out to do. Look at that layer count on the right though. Every one of those layers that's a shadow and every one of those layers that is an overlay also has a mask on it, which means that each one of those layers counts for 2 layers. So that means that we have 15 layers already, and we've only got 3 shapes that we're working with a shadow and a highlight on each one of those. So let's go ahead and delete all this because this sucks. This is going to hit our layer limit super fast. There's got to be a better way to do this. So why don't we try out Alpha Lock? Let's go into our layers again, tap on the orange one, and then select Alpha Lock. You can see its background on that layer changes a little. Let's go back to our shadow, create a new layer, set it to multiply. Well, something's going on here. We cannot color within the shape by doing that. How do we color within the shape? Well, we have to actually color on the same layer that is alpha locked, which means that it is that color. If we now set it to multiply, the whole layer turns to multiply. You can't really get what we're going for using alpha lock here because we want to be able to edit it later. We don't want it to be embedded in the same layer. So there's probably a lot of you that are going, well, duh, that's because you're supposed to be using a clipping mask. Let's go ahead and use a clipping mask. So when you change the layer to a clipping mask, it basically parents it to the layer below it. And now anything that you paint on that layer will stay within the bounds of the layer below it. You can actually add multiple clipping masks, which I'll go ahead and do here. And you can set this one now to overlay, and you can go ahead and paint your overlay color like that. And then of course you can go back to your previous layer and you can select it, and then you can delete away on that highlight, similar to what you would do with the layer mask. Now the thing that's nice here is that of course we don't have an extra layer, so we don't have that mask layer for each one of these layers. So this kind of seems like the right way to go in a lot of ways. You don't have those extra layers, it feels kind of natural, you can just sort of parent these layers and it all works out. The reality though is for this type of a flow, where this is going to be your main way of shading your entire thing, this is also completely inferior. The reason being is that if you now wanted to go into any one of these color fields and you wanted to add some extra stuff to them, like let's imagine it was skin and you wanted to add blush or 5 o'clock shadow or something like that, basically some local color variations, you have to do it on the layer that that field is because it's parented. If you insert a brand new layer in between that the main shape and then the clipping mask, it will disable the clipping mask. You can then paint in your blush or whatever, and then if you turn that clipping mask back on, it'll parent to the blush. You would have to merge those layers again, and so now here we have another option that is inferior to the select paint, select clear. Now, are these completely useless tools? Not at all. They just don't really apply to what we are trying to achieve with the methodology that I've explained before and with what I use in my painting. So let's use select paint, select clear. We have our 3 shapes, and then on the very top of that folder, or not in the folder but above it, we have a multiply layer. Let's select that orange shape and then go back to our multiply layer and start painting. And now we have the shadow and it's cast on the orange. But as you can see here, it's also on the blue. We don't want it on the blue, so we move up a layer in the stack. We select it and then we clear it from that shadow layer. Now we reselect that blue by holding the selection button at the top. It'll reselect your last selection. And we paint again on that shadow layer. You can see there we've painted it in. We've got shadow on the orange, we've got shadow on the blue. We then clear it from the green and we paint the shadow on the green. We have the shadows exactly how we want. We've got them on one nice tidy multiply shadow layer. We create a new layer that's set to overlay. We grab our blue like we did before, we paint that, and then we select the blue, we clear it away, and then we reselect it so that we can now paint the highlight on the blue shape. Then we do the same thing. We select green, we clear it from the blue, we then select it again, and we paint in our highlight. Now the nice thing is we have this one shadow layer that we can then select and we can clear away from the highlight. This way we have just 2 layers that is the entirety of our lighting for this particular piece. They're right there at the top, so we've gone from 15 in the one example and then however many in the examples after that to simply 2. We have our 3 color fields, and then we also have our 2 lighting layers. Now this could get more complex, absolutely, but the other ones get more complex, they get exponentially more complex, while this still stays pretty manageable. So let's get back to where we were in the piece. Now that you've seen my explanation as to why I use some methods over others, and there is also still the Select Paint, Select Clear video in the description below in case you'd like some more information on that, you can understand what I'm doing here. Each one of these layers, from her body and neck to her bone clavicles, to the wounds, to her jaw, to her skin, her eyes, her hair, all of this, they're all on different layers, and we're using one shadow layer at the very top in order to capture what we're doing right here. We select the bottommost layer, we paint, we select the next layer up from that and clear it from that shadow layer, and then reselect it and paint in that shadow layer, so that we're always basically painting the area we want to paint, and then we move to the next area, we're clearing away all of the shadow layer that overlaps with it, and then re-trapping it so that we can paint in that area. It's a way to give us some control, especially when I'm dealing with a brush like this. It's a little bit more wild. Now I keep saying one shadow layer, but one of the things that we're doing here is we're actually using multiple shadow layers in order to do everything we want. I wouldn't say that it's as clean as saying that I have an ambient occlusion layer and then a directional light shadow, that type of thing. It's not quite that clear, but that's essentially what I'm doing. I'm using 2 shadow layers in order to get 2 different things out of them. Now what you just saw there was me adding in some of these freckly sort of decay things across her. Also the blush in her nose and her cheek, which I do adjust again later. Those types of things can't be added in with the clipping mask layer without committing them already to that layer that the coarse shape that the clipping mask is reacting to. So now we're going through the shadows, we're maintaining the general directional light of coming from sort of the top right to the bottom left, but also the light is a little in front of the figure as opposed to being directly horizontal to the figure in space. So now what I'm doing here is I'm using the techniques that you see me do in previous videos where I'm painting, and then I'm using like the eraser to pull back, except I'm just happen to be using this brush. Now, occasionally in this piece, I will use a softer brush or a softer eraser to try and adjust something. However, in the subsequent pieces you're going to see in the next few weeks, I try to do that less and less so that I'm only using the turpentine brush so that I can just sort of commit to it a little bit more and try to not mix the different methods. That way it's not like this sort of like weird airbrushy soft thing when the whole thing is supposed to look a little bit more painterly. So now we've moved on to the highlight layer. This is, as you saw in my demo of the different masking techniques, this is that blue right there. That sharp blue that you're seeing right there is the blue that is used for the highlight, and it's a reduced opacity set to overlay. Now, what you end up having with this technique is you end up having a folder full of flats that all have their local color plus whatever additional things you want, like blush, or in this case that decay blue freckly thing, or maybe you want like the teeth to be a different color, which I do eventually add into this, or the lips. The lips are like an adjustment layer on top of the skin. See right there is the teeth changing color, and then on above that in a separate folder you have your shadows and your highlights, and it allows everything to be separate and adjustable in a really nice elegant way while keeping your layer count down as well. In order to do her cast shadow, I duplicated her entire form, and then I went in and repainted it once I had it there so that it also stayed looking painterly as opposed to looking like a digital direct copy. Now we've got this light that's cast across her, so this is another multiply layer on top of everything. You can see those brush strokes going back and forth because when it lays down really rough, and in some cases that's great, and in some cases it's not. So I handle it different ways depending. Now the shadow that she's casting on that back wall would be the same for the shadow that she's casting, plus the shadow for whatever the light is that's blocking the light. It would not necessarily 100%, there might be some bleed, but for something as stylized as this, I think that it works out just fine. Now we're putting a little bit of reflection in her eyes from her skin and from the background. Now we're just adding some extra little lighting touches, some extra bounce from her skin onto her hair. And really the end here, we put her faded sort of fisheye, dead fisheye eyes in there. And that's basically it. That's the end of this piece. So I hope everybody enjoyed this video and this particular piece of art. I'm proud of this, so I'm just really into it. I think it came out exactly how I wish I would have hoped I'd done it way back in the past. And I hope you also enjoyed the deeper dive into the turpentine brush and the different methods of masking things away. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next video. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.